Hey everyone, welcome back to Tea with the Supremes. Julie here with Cassandra and Ebony, as
Hey,
always.
what's up, everyone?
This week is National Suicide Prevention Week. So, with that, we are going to be talking about suicide and everything involved with that. It's a raw topic, and it could get emotional, so just be ready, I guess. And first question, do any of you have personal experience with suicide, either ideations personally, experience with losing someone to suicide, anything like that you would be comfortable sharing?
Yes, unfortunately. So, I don't know very many educators who have not, in this day and age, experienced the loss of a student tragically through suicide. Unfortunately, it's very common, and it should be an uncommon occurrence, but it's a common occurrence. And I will say one of the most poignant conversations that I've had around the topic of suicide was because of the late great notorious B.I.G. And you should know who Biggie is. But if you don't, let's be realistic. I'm still a New Yorker. And Biggie had a song called Suicidal Thoughts. And I thought it was so profound that the person who we were having this conversation, that was their introduction to the kids. And I was like, really? You gonna talk about Biggie? That's what we're gonna do. But it was such a relatable something. And I say all that because the fear around suicide makes it so unrelatable as a topic. Parents think never their kids, you've never thought about it. And then when you ask adolescents, more of them have had suicidal thoughts than people knew. So I think, and I'm trying to say this without exposing anyone's personal story, I think just having a conversation is a powerful ring in the link to connect you, the adult, in this case, to the adolescent that's having those thoughts and processes
I
about.
do want to comment just on that because one of the most common misconceptions is that if you bring it up to someone who has not already brought it up, that you are putting the idea in their head. And that's not how suicide works. A lot of people think that that is, if you ask a depressed person if they're suicidal and they weren't, all of a sudden they will be. That is not how that works. They've done tons of research that shows that is not how that works. So the conversation is not going to elicit the thoughts. If the thoughts are there, it has been a process for them to become there. So the conversation is not unhealthy. And I just want to put that out there because a lot of people make the assumption that it is.
Absolutely. I use that example of the song because there's a lyric in the song that says, minus the foul language, it goes like, I'm a piece of crap. It ain't hard for you to tell that I'm a piece of crap. And it was like a light clicked on for the adolescents that were in that moment with us. And it was like, yeah, I know. That's why it doesn't matter whether I'm here. And it was the catalyst for the conversation. That one little line, and there were other lines in the song. We're not going to rap out Biggie, but it was like, I'm not worth it. I don't care. Nobody would miss me if I'm gone. This is why I figured this will be the best way. It'll make, you know, everybody's life better if I'm not here. And it's like, it's very hard to put myself in that moment and say, have I ever thought that life would be better if I wasn't here? And if I'm honest, there were times that I'm like, you know what? If I wasn't even around, if I wasn't in this situation, man, life would be so much better. And nobody would have to worry. And I had to take a step back, like, oh my God, wow. In the same way they had those realizations, other people, other adults in the room were like, if I'm honest, I felt like that. I don't think I've gotten to the point to say I would take my life, but those thoughts, idealizing, what happens if I'm not here at the end, so, as Jules said, having these conversations for me, as we talk about prevention in this week, having these conversations and acknowledging these thoughts and putting voice to them. I think a lot of times what happens is we don't put voice, or the person, I can't speak for anyone who's committed suicide, unfortunately. A lot of the times what I hear in the aftermath is, I wish they would have said something. I wish I would have known. It's just this conversation, just the conversation, starting it, whatever the catalyst is, having that moment.
I think as much as we want people to talk, other people have to be willing to listen and to take action, because that's that next step. So many people say you can't see the signs of depression. Me, I can, because I have depressive tendencies, so I can recognize it in a heartbeat. But someone who has never, I shouldn't say has never, because we all go through ups and downs in our lives. But someone who's never been at that low, can't really recognize that somebody needs help. So I think the action plan would have to be, for example, me, right? I was a emo little teenager. Parents went through a divorce. I was very, very depressed when I was 15. And I had submitted like a poem I had wrote to a writing contest in high school, right? Immediately, my teacher went to my guidance counselor. My guidance counselor pulled me out of class and said, "Hey, like, you okay? You good? Like, what's going on? Like, I know you submitted that and it's like really good, but I just wanted to check in with you to make sure, like, are your emotions okay? Like, I know you're going through a rough time right now with your parents getting a divorce. So there needs to be an action plan."
I agree totally. I've had to do that as an educator, and it's a very difficult call to make, because as you're looking at, and it was literally the almost verbatim the same situation, except for they weren't, submitting anything, and they were just turning in some work, and it was so dark. Like, it was so dark, and I'm like, and then as they were just doodling on the paper, you could see the images, and I'm like, okay, something's not right. So I think you have to listen, and listening goes further than just hearing the person. Like, you have to be aware. One of the things we talk about, especially in our field, is being attentive and aware to see the things that's happening. But I think that's something that should be standard training, not just for people that are in education or in the mental health profession. And I'm not telling you to be the counselor and try to go in and fix the problem. Hell, we don't do that as counselors. But I'm saying to have your eyes open to acknowledge, you really need to be able to see something is wrong. Like, you don't have to know what's wrong, but you get, oh, you know what? Something is not right here. Who do I talk to? Who do I say something? Then what you cast in the action plan. Like, I need to reach out to somebody. Look, I don't know what to do in this situation, but I'm just telling you, something feels off. Like, we're such a laser focused tunnel vision society that I focus on what's in front of me, and I focus on my four and no more, and da 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 da, and that's it. And we can't be that way. There's a African proverb that says it takes a village. Like, it's not just that one mom, that one dad, that one grandmother, that one grandfather, that one aunt, one uncle, whoever is the guardian of that person. It takes a village. You should be able to see that, something is wrong. And I don't want to put the responsibility on someone else. So if someone committed suicide, I'm deeply sorry for your loss, and it's not your fault that you didn't see the signs. But I'm just speaking as a society as a whole, that we should be more aware of what's happening around us.
I also think that ties into breaking the mental health stigma, because a lot of people think that mental health isn't health. I'm the first one to tell you guys when my vibe's off, and you guys can tell when the vibe is off. So I think it's also important that your support system around you knows how to recognize that you might be falling a little bit. And how do you think how do you think we could simplify an action plan for a support system, let's say a family?
So I recently went to a suicide prevention conference. I apologize. I have a baby in the background. So if you hear weird noises, it's the baby. So I went to a suicide prevention conference, and the biggest thing was most people don't know what to do. The same with educators. They often recognize something, but they don't know what to do with that, or they don't get to the counselor soon enough, or whatever. And this man, who had also experienced suicidal ideations, I think he actually had made an attempt on his own life at one point. He said, you just need to stop the action from happening. That's the first step. So if it is get that child to take a nap, he said, even if the thoughts persist in the dream, that's not action though. Those thoughts are there, but there's not going to be action. And the first step is to stop the action. So another huge piece of that is removing the access to lethal means. There are a lot of people, not just, there are a lot of children, first responders, people that have experienced trauma in their life. They're dealing with things, demons in their own life, trying to process things, and they have very readily available access to lethal means. And when you do that, it only takes one time. So those are the first two steps. The first step is prevent the action, whatever that means. Get the person, literally, like usually if a person is depressed and they're napping all the time, that's not a good sign, which is true. They're going to need some sort of support from a professional. However, that is a step. If that's the only thing you can do, that's still a step. And then remove access to lethal means, because if they don't have means to commit the action, it buys you more time to get them professional support so you can do what's hopefully necessary to mitigate.
I like that. I think that's important. Even if it's going for a walk, just removing that person from that room or that space might be that step that they need to get them out of the headspace.
Yeah, it has to be a separate thought process. I do just want to talk to about not just recognizing the signs, but really taking them seriously, because that is a lot of the problem as well, especially with young ones. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 24. And there are increasingly more little ones committing suicide, especially now that they have not only access to means, but also access via the internet to education to know how they need to do it to make it happen. And I will say for me personally, I want to caveat this first. I just learned this today, actually. Trauma, there's no actual definition for trauma. Trauma is how your brain interprets a situation. So you can have a traumatic event that really largely wouldn't be traumatic for most people. The presenter that I learned this from actually said there was a situation where she had a client who, at 5 years old, she accidentally got locked out of the school during recess for 5 minutes. And her response, she was devastated, horrified. It gave her PTSD. So normally that wouldn't elicit a trauma response, but that's what it did for her. It was a very traumatic event for her. I had, when I was young, a series of minor traumatic events, and I didn't know how to process them. I was very young, and for a long time, I really struggled with depression, to the point that I brought it up a lot, that I was depressed. I didn't think anyone cared about me. I was very, very shy, and it was not uncommon information, at least, in my family, but it wasn't necessarily taken seriously because I was a kid, and kids say things. It just is what it is. So it's like, yeah, stop crying. A lot of kids get that, stop crying. In my brain, I was constantly crying because no one loves me. No one cares about me, which wasn't the truth, but I was a child and I didn't understand that. And when I went, you know, in public, I would always have a smile on my face. I got so many compliments about how great my smile was, and I was always a happy kid. Even to this day, I have relatives that are like, "I love you. You're always smiling. You were always smiling." Meanwhile, I was like the most depressed child all the time. And legitimately, the only reason that I did not hurt myself is because I didn't know how to do it successfully, which is hindsight is, you know, devastating. However, the access to means and the access to knowledge of how to make those means work, the most common way that children, female children, commit suicide is via hanging, because they can find out easily online how to make that happen. And for me, I knew that if I took pills, what if it doesn't work? What if I get sick? My father had a shotgun and I was like, I have little arms. What if I aim wrong? Like, it's horrifying now looking back to think like all of this stuff happened in my head, but it did. And while people knew that I was going through stuff, they were like, well, she's just a kid. She's just a moody child, which is what a lot of kids get. Because what's happening to them, people look at it as like, oh, a girl pulled her hair, or I don't know, some minor thing could happen that a logical adult would be like, that's nothing. But to a child, their brains don't work that way, especially if they've experienced other trauma or situations that are making their brain even more unstable.
So to take it another route from you, Jules, as you were talking, as we look at Prevention Week, you focused on the trauma that children express and that unheard or unaddressed trauma, however they receive it. I think in many instances that I've been able to research and see and even hear firsthand accounts or secondhand accounts rather of that experience, that same trauma that's unaddressed in children continues to fester, if you will, and becomes compounded trauma that now adults experience. And then we, stories are like, well, what made them do it? It was just one something, but that one something was compounded upon other somethings that weren't addressed. And I think for me, not just for me, but in the circles that I understood in the African American community, suicide wasn't something we talked about. Like, suicide wasn't something, it was what other races did. We don't kill ourselves and we don't commit suicide. That's not what we do, right? That's what I heard. And then I think the conversation for me, and I know it's different for every individual, the conversation became very personal for me with someone who I did not know. It wasn't personal, but there was, I assume it's common knowledge, but I will not make that assumption. So a young man by the name of Khalif, what was Khalif's? Khalif Browder.
Browder, yeah.
Right. So he was a young man who was in his teens. Short end of the story, he was going home and he got pulled over. Well, he was walking and he got hemmed up by some cops and for stealing a young kid's backpack. And he wound up going to Rikers Island. And if you're not a New Yorker, Rikers is like prison on top of prison. Like Rikers it literally is an island. You have to like take a couple of trains and a couple of buses to get to Rikers. Like, it's massive and craziness happens as it does in any place. But I mean, like real deal, Rikers is no joke. And I've worked in a prison before.
And he was 16 at the time. He was a child.
He was a kid. So the end of the story, unfortunately, Khalif finally gets out. He was like in solitary for, years. They wound up. And Rikers is not like, it's a whole nother world. And I've been in prisons. It's a whole nother world. Anyway, Khalif comes home and he's getting readjusted. And then people start getting on to his story. Like, nobody knew what happened. And the end of the story is he committed suicide. I don't even think he was out for a full year. I would have to go back and look at the details. And that was maybe like 2015, 2016. when unfortunately Khalif took his life, that started a conversation. Like people jumped in and they were like, oh my God, how could this tragedy happen? And then I started going back and looking, and these things were happening constantly. Like it was a whole lot of people committing suicide and nobody talked about it. It was like it was hushed and put under the rug. You don't talk about that. You know, they did such a horrific thing. And now at this stage of life, as we're transitioning into the mental health profession and each of us have our own reasons for doing it, I see it as the unanswered trauma, the same trauma that was compounded upon that wasn't answered as a child and then wasn't answered as an adolescent. Because what Jules said, we tell the kids, just suck it up. It's no big deal. Is that I've said it as a parent. Oh my God, get up. What are you crying over there for? Let's, and now that I know better, I think as we're talking about prevention and all the things that we've said and creating the action plan and hearing and all those things, that you have to allow voice for that trauma. You have to encourage the voice for that trauma. For all intents and purposes, Khalif's life looked so much better. He was out. People were hearing his story. Jay-Z is talking about his story and he's on the news and he's doing this and he's doing that. Yet that trauma was still, and I don't want to speak for, him, his family, things of that nature. I'm just saying, as we look at this topic and we discuss it, it's never just a surface something, as we're looking at it and we're talking about it. It just has to, I think we have to be able to give voice, allow that person, that individual to give voice to that, because that trauma just compounds upon the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And then when it gets to that point where you feel I would be better off, the world would be better off if I wasn't here, sometimes you're unreachable. And hence we're talking about this because a suicide has happened. So I really want to stress that if we did it when Jules was talking about it, when Cass was talking about it, at that age, maybe we could stop the next person from, we can prevent it as an adult, we can prevent it as a child, each of those different levels to that trauma.
I'm gonna put you guys on something. So TikTok has an algorithm, right? And so based on that algorithm, they will show you videos that are similar to that algorithm. My algorithm has gotten so specific to my trauma responses. It is wild, right? So things that, and I'm not saying self-diagnose, go see a professional. If you feel like you are having any symptoms, please seek professional help. But things I didn't know were trauma responses, because I follow professionals on TikTok too. Things I didn't think were trauma responses are trauma responses. Like little minute things are trauma responses. And you would never think that me overreacting to something is a trauma response. So being able to not only recognize it for your loved ones, but recognizing it for yourself too, I think plays a big piece into it. And it's a lot easier said than done, because when you're in a irrational state of mind, it's very difficult to make the decisions you want to and reach out to the people who will want to help you. But all I'm saying is it only takes a text or a voice message. My fiance and I have a safe word, not like in the bedroom, but like when I say this word, he knows. Shut the hell up.
That took a whole
No.
word. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, but if I say this word, he knows like I'm not in a good headspace and he needs to, I just tell him to validate my feelings. And
No, I
just,
like that you do that. That's a smart thing to do.
Mhm.
I wouldn't never thought of that, but that's a good thing.
And it's just like a small thing, but it really, really helps, and granted, I'm very blessed to have the support system I have in my life, but there are resources outside of friends and family. If you feel guilty or embarrassed to talk about your feelings with your friends and family, there are free resources. There's the National Suicide Hotline, and it's a counseling session. You don't have to give them any personal information. So just be aware, guys.
Yeah, I also just want to reiterate how common it is to have suicidal thoughts. A lot of people think, because no one talks about it, a lot of people think I'm the only one thinking like this and I'm a crazy person. So then they're not going to talk about it. That's just more detrimental. There's a thing called toxic stress. So if you are under stress for prolonged periods of time, it screws up your cortisol levels and it changes the chemical balance in your brain. Especially if this is prolonged, it doesn't necessarily mean children, but it does affect children significantly because it changes their brain if they're subjected to consistent stress when they're young. And that even if they grow up and they have a healthy life after that, that doesn't mean that someday down the line, something's going to trigger things that, have been altered within their brain and cause you to need further support.
I'm glad Jules said that though, because I think as we're talking about prevention and we're going to list some specific ways to address suicide prevention, that there's a number of things that will place someone in, unfortunately, the perfect circumstances that they feel suicide is the best option. So I'm glad Jules touched on some things are biology. Some things are, your cortisol levels are off. They're too high, too low. There could be a chemical imbalance in the individual. And some things are medically treated. Some things are mentally treated. Some things are a combination of both. Too much testosterone, not enough testosterone, too much estrogen, not enough estrogen. Like, there are so many things that go into the perfect storm of a person being in that moment that they take their own life. So when we talk about prevention, there's an entire gambit of things that must be addressed. So it's never just, it's not limited to what we're saying here and now, but it may be seeing a medical doctor along with seeing a counselor, or, getting in contact with those resources that, were mentioned, the suicide prevention hotline and all those things that can help when something is triggered or when someone is triggered.
I also just want to speak to survivor's guilt because that is very common with suicides. So the overwhelming opinion is that there's always signs, which there are subtle signs, but not always. Some people are very good at guarding themselves and keeping face. They might blow up here or there, short fuse, but a short fuse getting angry isn't interpreted as depression. So that's often missed. And those people too are not going to ask for help. They're not going to reach out. So sometimes it is a shock to everyone. And your perception of someone's life could be great, and internally they're dealing with things that no one could possibly imagine. So survivor's guilt is a very real thing. Obviously, there's nothing you can do. Again, if you heard our last podcast, that's the way I live my mindset. There's nothing you could do about the past. You just have to learn from what you have experienced. In my life, I've experienced two people that have committed suicide, a family member and a friend's family member, and both devastating, both kind of unexpected for the most part. And both of those families happen to be very religious, very Christian, and in a large portion of the Christian community, suicide is condemning. So compounding not only the guilt of not knowing what's going on or being able to make a difference, but then having to process that loss in a very devastating way. It brings like a whole nother level of devastation. So it's just very difficult for everyone involved. There's a lot of guilt and there's a lot of support that is needed all around. That's why it needs to be talked about, especially if you're in a community where that's your belief system and that is a condemning act. In order to prevent it, you have to talk about it and mitigate it before it happens. And if you have lost someone to suicide, we are so incredibly sorry. And there's nothing you can do about the past. All you can do is learn and hopefully catch a sign in the future or show compassion and love to someone that might be going through either as a survivor or as someone who's dealing with ideations.
Jules, I'm very glad you said that, because when I was thinking of the quote that I would use for today, it really was to the survivors, because I can't speak to those who've taken their life, but that guilt that surrounded, I remember our previous podcast that you just alluded to, looking at those stages of grief. And the quote was by Jennifer Betts, and I have to give credit to someone else who gave it to me during a difficult time. And it says, it isn't that you didn't reach for them. It's just that it was too dark to see your hand in the blackness. Like it even when we were talking earlier, and it was like, there's some signs, and I said it, you should see. However, that is to be aware and to pay attention. That does not place blame on the individual that's left, the survivor, because survivor's remorse is a real thing, and survivor's guilt. So that is not your fault. Because if you are determined to take your life, then you will take your life, if that's what you are determined to do. However, as you try to move forward, because that heaviness and that weight of the responsibility, we internalize that and we take that in. And if I would have did this, and if I would have did that, there's if is a dangerous word. So keep in mind that guilt associated with that trauma, because you've now experienced the trauma. If you are left behind as the loved one, as the friend, as the enemy, whatever way you were left behind, there is that guilt attached to it. As we look back, if I would have did this, if I would have saw the sign, if I would have done this, if I wouldn't do it. And that's a dangerous place to live. So remember, in that if, whatever that if looks like for you, it wasn't that you didn't reach. It was that they couldn't see you reaching. They couldn't see through their trauma, through that dark cloud that was in front of them. And if I'm not looking, or I'm refusing to look, it doesn't matter how long or how far you reach your hand out to save me. If I don't choose to take it, I don't choose to take it. So do not live in that place of grief, in that place of brokenness. Take this experience and grow from that experience.
I also want to expand on that a little, saying that your grief is valid. Even if you lose someone to suicide and you don't understand that's not in your belief system and you don't approve of the way they ended their life. If you are grieving, that's still valid grief. Whether or not it was the person's choice, you experienced a loss and your loss is valid. And regardless of your belief system, you are free to process that grief, and you can be devastated because it's your grief and your loss. So just acknowledging, however you lose someone, it is still a valid loss in your life, and you're justified in your grief.
And I think because, and I go back, I remember saying this before, for me, my term is our moral compass has shifted. And granted, I am one of those people, that is my belief, but that's not the time for me to tell you my belief. That I believe this individual did the wrong thing because they committed suicide. Outside of my beliefs, that's a personal thought for me. When you're grieving, that's not the time for me to share that thought with you. I want to be with you in that grief, because whether you lost this loved one because they were taken in a tragic accident, or whether you lost this loved one because they took their life, that doesn't negate your grief. They're not here anymore. If anything, it would make your grief even that more difficult, because it was in the purpose of this conversation. It was their choice to make, and they made the choice. Now, on the flip side of that, if you're in a crisis or you're in a crisis state, you are not in control of your thought process in that capacity, and you make a decision. I used to tell my students, never make a permanent decision in a temporary circumstance. When your emotions, your good or bad, rage, love, whatever, you do not make permanent decisions in temporary circumstances. The decision,
Much easier said than done.
right, is much easier said than done. And I think having those, back to the prevention aspect, having those intentional conversations with other people, we were focusing on adolescents and youth, but with anyone, like having those intentional conversations to give voice to those concerns, to give voice to those hurts, to give voice to that you being intentional in that moment. I think, as we discussed this on this particular week, that part of that process of prevention is that conversation. You being honest enough to say, this is where I think this is where they're at. I'm not really sure. I don't know, but I want to give them an opportunity to express it. You know what I'm saying? I want to give them an opportunity to say it. And I want to say something, because when it's over with, that guilt kicks in even more, I don't want to say it over with like that, but when if that traumatic something happens and they take their life and you're just left holding the bag, what do I do with this? How do I process this? Discuss those things beforehand. If you see something, say something. If you assume something, it doesn't hurt for you to pick up the phone and call the National Suicide Hotline and say, listen, these are the things I'm seeing. What should I do? Reach out. Listen, I don't really know how to do this, but look, school counselor, I don't really know, but I need you to, I wasn't sure in some of those instances, but I'd rather to be unsure and say something than to be unsure, not say something, and the end result is when I get back to work that this child has taken their life. So it is imperative that you give voice to that, whatever way you give voice to it.
And just in addition to that, build a culture that it's okay to not be okay, because there are not always signs. And even if there are, or even if the person knows that they are struggling and they need help, if they do not have a support system in which it's okay to say, I'm not okay, they're not going to say, I'm not okay. So build the culture that not everybody is okay all the time. That's 100% the truth for literally everyone. It's impossible to be okay all the time. So when you're not okay, it's okay to say you're not okay. So build that culture so that when someone is not okay, they feel comfortable telling you, listen, I'm not okay. I need somebody to lean on, because that's what we need. We need to build the empathy so people are not scared to say, I'm not okay, I need help, because otherwise they won't be getting the help that they need. Any final thoughts, ladies?
I'm really happy we had this conversation, because coming from somebody who used to self-harm and was at very low points in her life, had I had these conversations and felt like I could talk to more people about it, probably wouldn't have done the stupid shit that I would have done. And I don't mean to minimize that. I just, looking back on it, yeah, not my brightest moment. But
Hindsight is a powerful teacher, especially the younger you are. You grow with age and experience. You get wisdom with age and experience. So I
yeah.
second that. Continue. Sorry to interrupt, but I
No,
second
you're
exactly
fine.
what you're saying.
Yeah, and just I want everybody to remember that, just to echo what Julie was saying, it's okay to feel. Like, you don't have to be embarrassed for feeling really sad or feeling really anxious. Like, we're human. You know, we go through cycles. That's how our brain works. That's how we're wired, you know? And connecting it back to that trauma response, every situation we're faced with as an adult, how we react is essentially our inner child coming out, or our inner adolescence coming out, or the compilation of traumas that we've experienced in our lives. So remember to just be kind to yourself, because you're not alone in this crazy thing we call life.
First, I want to say to Cass, I love you. And I'm so glad that you are choosing a healthier life path. And I want our audience, as diverse as they are, I want them to realize this is not a one particular something issue. This is not a issue for affluent people, or this is not an issue for non-African Americans, because that's a lot of the things that I hear. Suicide has no respect of person, of socioeconomic status, of education level. We all have seen and experienced suicide on a range of things, whatever that thing that makes you other. So have the conversation, give voice to the conversation, give grace to yourself if you didn't see the sign. And I want you to give grace to the person that's struggling, because it's a struggle. It is a everyday intentional walk. For me, I would say a walk of faith, to do better and to be better, and to not cut yourself today, to not do harm to yourself today, whatever that looks like. And take the time to become educated, become knowledgeable. We use the internet for everything other than what we're supposed to. You know, there's a lot of resources out there to help you help someone else, and even help you to help yourself. So give yourself grace and be intentional with your words and your actions.
Thank you, Ebony. And I agree completely, and really take what she said to heart, to be mindful and to give yourself grace. And I really appreciate that you said give the person grace, because if someone, I can say from personal experience and personal thoughts, it is a constant struggle. I will say to this day, I still am fearful sometimes of where my headspace is. And it's a conscious thought that I know I need to address my self-care. I'm going down a path that's not positive. So it is a consistent struggle. It doesn't necessarily ever go away. So you have to give the person grace. So thank you. And with that, let's end our session as we always do with season 2 with some mindfulness.
Okay, I want everybody to take a deep breath in and out. Unclench your jaw, relax a little bit. So for this week's mindfulness, I want you guys, so something that helped me through my depressive states, and still does to this day, is music. I feel like where words fail, music speaks, so to say. So even if it's just once this week, if you're in your car, you're sitting on your couch, laying in bed, I want you to put on a song that has helped you through a hard time in your life, with your eyes closed, and just feel and just be in the moment with your body and your thoughts and your emotions. And it will be magical. I promise.
And just to tie that to the topic, there is a song, if you have not heard it, by Chord Overstreet called Hold On. and he is singing about a friend who is in the bathroom who's going through a suicide attempt, and it is the most emotional song. And if you are dealing with survivor's guilt, or you are contemplating something, know that there's someone there trying to make you hold on. And it's very cathartic in those emotions to listen to that song. And I second music. Music is so powerful for any emotion. So yes, give yourself that self-care and just rock out, mellow out, whatever you need to do.
Exactly.
And with that, we will end this week's Tea with the Supremes. Come back next week and sip some more tea with us. Bye, everybody.
Bye, y'all.
Bye, Supremes.